In the vast landscape of American dynasties, one name stands as a towering enigma: the Getty family. It all began with Jean Paul Getty, a visionary who transformed his father's modest oil ventures into the colossal Getty Oil Company, striking black gold in Oklahoma and forging a fortune that soared to $2 to $3 billion by the mid-20th century, a sum worth an astonishing $12 to $18 billion in today's world. Yet this empire was more than mere wealth. It was a saga of ambition, power, and unrelenting complexity. From the sun-scorched deserts of the Middle East, where Getty secured game-changing oil concessions, to the opulent halls of the Jean Paul Getty Trust, endowed with $10.5 billion to rival the philanthropic giants of our time, the Gettys redefined what it meant to leave a legacy. But every triumph came at a cost. Behind the headlines of their cultural contributions, most notably the world-renowned Getty Museum, lurked shadows of scandal. A notorious kidnapping that gripped the globe, heartbreaking personal losses to addiction, whispers of tax evasion, and a family fractured by 5 marriages and the burdens of 16 heirs, including the ill-fated Jean Paul Getty III. This is not just the story of a family, it is a chronicle of human resilience and frailty, where unimaginable wealth collides with the weight of legacy. Join us as we journey into the heart of the Getty dynasty, peeling back the layers of their secrets, their triumphs, and the tragedies that continue to echo through time. From new money to old money, picture this: a fortune forged in the early 20th century, transforming raw, rugged new money into the polished prestige of old money through jaw-dropping philanthropy, world-class art collections, and sprawling estates that scream opulence. But beneath the glitz, there's a darker side: kidnappings, drug-fueled tragedies, and family feuds that kept the Gettys tethered to their rough-around-the-edges roots. From George Getty's humble beginnings to Jean Paul Getty's reign as the world's richest man and the enduring legacy of the $10.5 billion Jean Paul Getty Trust, this is a story of ambition, art, and anguish. Let's start at the beginning, with George Franklin Getty, born in 1855 in Maryland. This guy was the ultimate rags-to-riches story. As a kid, he showed up at Ohio Northern University in 1875, wearing hand-me-down clothes that barely fit, sleeves too short, pants riding high. Shy and unassuming, he scraped by with just enough cash to start college. But George was no slouch. He graduated, became a lawyer, and by 1904, he ditched the courtroom for the oil fields of Oklahoma, where the early 20th century oil boom was kicking into high gear. Think of it like the Wild West, but with gushing black gold instead of 6-shooters. George founded the Minnesota Oil Company, striking it rich and laying the foundation for what would become the Getty Empire. His wife, Sarah Catherine McPherson Risher Getty, born in 1852, was his rock, managing the family's growing wealth with a sharp eye and a steady hand. Together, they were the spark that ignited a dynasty, though tragedy struck early when their daughter died in a typhoid epidemic, leaving their son, Jean Paul Getty, as their sole heir. Now, enter Jean Paul Getty, born in 1892 in Minneapolis. This guy was a force of nature. Educated at Oxford, where he earned a diploma in economics and political science, Jean Paul was a natural-born deal-maker. By 1916, at just 24, he'd made his first million buying and selling oil leases in Oklahoma, working alongside his dad. When George died in 1930, Jean Paul inherited a modest $500,000. Chump change compared to the $10 million fortune his father left behind, most of which went to Sarah, giving her control of the family's oil company. Why the small inheritance? George wasn't thrilled with Jean Paul's string of marriages and divorces, which had already started to pile up. But Jean Paul didn't let that slow him down. He he took his share and ran with it, turning Getty Oil into a global juggernaut. Here's where things get wild. In the 1930s, J. Paul made a move that changed everything. His mother convinced him to set up the Sarah C. Getty Trust, a $3.3 million investment vehicle designed to keep the family's wealth tax-free and secure for generations. This trust was like a financial superpower, giving J. Paul easy access to capital he used to snap up companies like Tidewater Oil and Mission Corporation. By the 1940s, he was playing in the big leagues, acquiring Pacific Western Oil, Skelly Oil, and even a stake in Spartan Aircraft, which he flipped into a mobile home business after World War II. But the real game changer came in 1949, when J. Paul took a massive gamble. He shelled out $9.5 million up front, plus $1 million a year, for a 60-year oil concession in the neutral zone between Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, a barren desert that hadn't produced a single drop of oil. 4 years and $30 million later, he hit the jackpot, with wells pumping 16 million barrels a year. That move catapulted him to billionaire status, and by 1957, Fortune magazine crowned him the richest living American, with a fortune estimated at $1.2 billion, about $8.6 billion in today's money. J. Paul wasn't just about oil, though. He was a man of contradictions, frugal to a fault, yet obsessed with beauty and culture. Stories of his penny pinching are legendary. He famously installed a payphone at his 72-room mansion, Sutton Place in England, so guests wouldn't rack up his phone bill. He haggled over everything from hotel suites to artwork, and even scolded his fifth wife, Teddy Getty Gaston, for spending too much on their terminally ill son's medical care. But this same guy poured his heart into collecting art. Starting in the 1930s, inspired by the 18th century French paintings of his New York landlord, Amy Guest, J. Paul amassed a collection that included Monets, Van Goghs, and rare Persian carpets, like the 16th century Ardabil carpet from Tabriz. In 1953, he founded the J. Paul Getty Museum in Malibu, initially housed in a wing of his ranch house. By 1974, he'd built a replica of an ancient Roman villa, the Getty Villa, to showcase his treasures. When he died in 1976, he left $661 million to the museum, creating the J. Paul Getty Trust, now the world's wealthiest art institution with a $10.5 billion endowment. The trust funds not just the Getty Villa, but also the Getty Center in Los Angeles, a $1.3 billion cultural complex that opened in 1997, complete with research libraries, conservation labs, and sculpture gardens. This wasn't just philanthropy, it was a bid for immortality, putting the Gettys on par with cultural giants like Carnegie and Guggenheim. But let's talk about the real estate, because the Gettys didn't just collect art, they collected properties that screamed power. Sutton Place, a 16th century Tudor estate in Surrey, England, was J. Paul's headquarters from 1959 until his death. Bought for a steal at £60,000, half what the previous owner paid, it was a symbol of his integration into Europe's elite, rubbing shoulders with dukes and aristocrats. Then there's the Getty Villa in Malibu, a sprawling estate that doubled as a museum, and Wormsley Park, another English estate later owned by his son, Jean Paul Getty Jr. These weren't just homes, they were statements, rivaling the ostentatious castles of media mogul William Randolph Hearst. The Gettys' real estate portfolio was their ticket to old money status, a deliberate move to shed the new money label of their oil baron roots, much like railroad tycoon Henry Flagler's alliances with high society. The Getty fortune itself was a beast of its own, At its peak, J. Paul controlled nearly 200 businesses, from Getty Oil to hotels like the Pierre in New York and a 15th century palace in Italy. The crown jewel, Getty Oil, was sold to Texaco in 1984 for a staggering $10.1 billion, orchestrated by Gordon Getty, who inherited a 40% stake in control of the Sarah C. Getty Trust. The sale wasn't without drama. It sparked a legal battle when Pennzoil, which had a prior agreement to buy Getty Oil, sued Texaco and won a $10.53 billion judgment, one of the largest civil verdicts in U.S. history. The Getty family walked away with billions, but the sale marked the end of their direct control over the oil empire. Still, the Sarah C. Getty Trust, valued at $4 billion at the time of the sale, ensured the family's wealth endured, with Forbes estimating the extended family's fortune at $5 billion in 2015. Unlike the Gould family, whose wealth fizzled out through reckless spending, the Gettys' trust structure mirrored the Mellon family's careful preservation, channeling money into philanthropy and cultural patronage. J. Paul Getty's opium trade ties picture Shanghai's Bund at dawn in the spring of 1925. A rust-flecked freighter noses up to the quay, its horns scattering gulls as longshoremen in frayed cotton tunics wrestle a string of mismatched crates onto the slick cobblestones. The bills of lading say machine spares and kerosene pumps. But tucked deep inside the cargo hold, lashed beneath the deck plates sealed in nondescript burlap sacks, lies something that will never appear on any public manifest: raw opium, sun-cured in the hills of Yunnan, ready to be boiled down, refined, and carried through a spider's web of middlemen to the morphine labs of Marseille, and eventually to the black market clinics of New York. Standing on the bridge wing, coat collar turned up against the river chill, is a junior American oilman whose name barely registers in the city's buzzing gossip columns, Jean Paul Getty. He has come to Asia to sign a series of routine freight contracts on behalf of his fledgling subsidiary, Pacific Western Oil Corporation. Yet before the decade is over, those dry, bureaucratic agreements will seed rumors, still whispered a century later, that the first gushers of the Getty fortune were lubricated not by crude alone, but by a trade as old as empire itself. Most people meeting Getty in the 1920s saw nothing more sinister than a driven young entrepreneur playing catch-up with Rockefeller's Standard Oil and the Anglo-Dutch juggernaut of Shell. Born in Minneapolis in 1892, educated at Oxford, where he preferred country house parties to tutorials, he returned to the States just as World War I ended, and the world's appetite for gasoline exploded. He bought leases around Tulsa, flipped a few for quick profits, borrowed aggressively, often from his own mother Sarah, and in 1927 folded his scattered stakes into Pacific Western, a vehicle nimble enough to chase speculative acreage anywhere ships could sail. Getty's early biographers, such as Robert Lenzner in Forbes magazine, 1985, and Russell Miller in The House of Getty, 1985, track those movements mainly through Oklahoma land filings and California production reports. What they missed, because the paper trail was famously opaque, were the Asia charters, one-off voyages of mixed cargo that periodically stitched Pacific Western tankers to ports better known for supplying Shanghai's opium dens than for fueling American automobiles. The pattern, teased out decades later by archivists at Hong Kong University's Swire Shipping Collection, is tantalizing but frustratingly circumstantial. In September 1923, the coastal steamer SS Ganges cleared Hong Kong loaded with medical alkaloids bound for British India and ostensibly for re-export to the pharmaceutical hub of Le Havre. The ship's owner of record was the Aspinall Line, But 3 pages deeper in the packet lies a charter party signed by a Pacific Western proxy. A nearly identical arrangement pops up in December 1924, this time between Shanghai and Port Said, route of choice for smugglers keen on the Suez shortcut. The cargo again appears as alkaloids, NES, custom shorthand for substances. The inspectors lacked either the mandate or the muscle to examine closely. The volumes, 12 tons on the first run, 14 on the second, far exceed legitimate hospital demand in France or Britain, a discrepancy noted by a League of Nations drug control officer filing his own memo ahead of the 1925 Geneva Opium Convention. It was an open secret that respectable shipping firms habitually logged opium as dyestuff or paint base. What startled investigators was that a tiny California oil outfit was dabbling in the same gray zone as the seasoned contrabandists of Bombay and Canton. To understand why Getty's name surfaces here, historians fall back on a well-worn analogy, the Delano precedent. Franklin Roosevelt's maternal grandfather, Warren Delano II, grew rich running opium into Qing China under the flag of Russell and Company. Family letters quoted in the New York Times, June 21, 2003, show Delano rationalizing the trade as a regrettable necessity in the age of free enterprise. Likewise, the Boston Cabots, memorialized in John K. Fairbanks' China-Bound, parlayed their own mid-19th century opium margins into railroads and banks back home. By the 1870s, Leland Stanford's Pacific steamers were rumored, in San Francisco Call, October 18, 1881, to carry opium ballast whenever ordinary freight ran light. Getty entered the Pacific game 50 years later, at a moment when U.S. Narcotics Commissioner Harry Anslinger's attention was glued to alcohol bootleggers, leaving Asian opiates a low-priority menace. The profit logic was brutal. Opium bought for $300 a case in Kunming, wholesaled for 10 times that in Cairo or Marseille. More if refined into heroin en route. Even a handful of clandestine loads could underwrite months of speculative drilling in the dusty leases of California's San Joaquin Valley. Evidence of Getty's direct involvement remains, at best, a lattice of suggestive shards. A 1932 diary entry by Captain William J. Blythe, held in the private papers of the Blythe family, and cited in a 2017 Guardian retrospective on illicit maritime networks, complains that Mr. G has again ordered special care with the extra freight, no tally sheets. In a separate folder at the Hoover Institution, researchers paging through Ralph K. Davies's correspondence, Davies later became wartime Deputy Petroleum Administrator, noticed repeated references to option bales delivered during Far East voyages, always billed to consultant accounts rather than to any oil affiliate. Neither note spells out opium, yet both mirror the oblique phrasing, chests, cargo of interest, client-sealed packages, found in the much earlier Delano ledgers once the code had been cracked by the Yale-Hutchins China Trade Project. Getty himself never addressed the rumors in public. The closest he came was a wry aside in his 1976 autobiography. Most of all, he proved that a kid from a brutal orphanage, a boy who'd been knocked down time and again, could rise to become a country king. His life was a testament to resilience, faith, and the power of a song to he my life and fortunes. I have always chosen to diversify cargoes and friendships. Contemporaries chalk that up to his famously sardonic humor, the same dry wit behind the apocryphal line, "$1 billion isn't what it used to be." But his son Gordon Getty, when pressed by Fortune reporter Annalyn Swan in a 1999 oral history interview, confessed that Dad's early cash flow was partly a black box. "I never asked, he never volunteered." Late in life, J. Paul donated manuscripts and artifacts to the Getty Museum. None included shipping papers from the 1920s. Scholars hunting for them in the Getty Research Institute's archives find a conspicuous gap, 1921 to 1929. Whether those files were lost, destroyed, or still locked in a private vault is an open question. Adding to the intrigue is a cluster of Middle Eastern telegrams tucked into the British National Archives, catalog F0371/12841, covering the years 1928-1930. They chronicle negotiations between Gulf monarchs and independent American speculators for drilling rights along the Arabia-Kuwait neutral zone. One cable, dated May 14, 1929, notes the arrival at Basra of a Pacific Western charter bearing well casing and medical stores. Medieval maps called that route the Spice Pipeline. Colonial naval logs updated it to the Cotton Opium Loop. Either way, it offered smugglers a discreet highway from Asia to the Mediterranean, skirting the more heavily policed Amoy-San Francisco corridor. Critics of the Getty opium thesis argue that all this is coincidence dressed up as conspiracy. Petroleum historian Daniel Yergin, responding to a reader's letter in Foreign Affairs, dismissed the story as seductive speculation built on absence of proof rather than presence of incriminating fact. Yergin's point is fair. No customs raid ever caught a Getty vessel red-handed. No court testimony ever named a Pacific Western officer in a trafficking indictment. Yet absence of proof is not proof of absence, especially when the industry's own playbook taught executives to bury controversial side deals inside labyrinthine freight contracts. Consider the testimony of British naval officer John Newbolt at the 1927 Royal Commission on Indian opium. Not 1 in 10 carriers on the Calcutta-Hankow run declares its real load to port authorities. Or reflect on the League of Nations Drug Control Bureau's 1930 annual report, which lamented that corporate umbrellas shield respectable shareholders from the knowledge of what their ships in fact carry. What we do know is that Getty's appetite for secrecy went beyond ordinary corporate prudence. He pioneered the use of numbered subsidiaries so opaque that even today researchers at the University of Oklahoma's Western History Collection struggle to map which wells belong to whom. He insisted that partners sign non-disclosure pledges decades before Silicon Valley made the NDA fashionable. And he cut deals, famously in 1949 with King Abdul Aziz ibn Saud, that blindsided rivals who assumed Standard Oil's diplomatic clout made it untouchable. In that light, a quiet dabble in the grayest of gray markets during the cash-hungry 1920s seems less an aberration than an early case study in Getty's risk calculus. If a moderate hidden gamble could finance a big, visible gamble, why blink? Jean Paul Getty, III's kidnapping ransom dispute, mid-July 1973, a warm Roman dusk curls around the narrow lanes off Piazza Farnese, the way cigarette smoke once clung to the lamps aboard those Pacific Western freighters we talked about earlier. Inside a tiny newsstand, a transistor radio blares the top 40, while a lanky 19-year-old American with mismatched socks, tousled blonde hair, and the cocky grin of someone who knows his surname can open any door in Europe, finishes a phone call, pockets his lira, and strolls into the amber streetlight. Seconds later, a black Alfa Romeo Giulia cuts the corner without headlights. 3 men jump out, a chloroform-soaked cloth flashes white, and Jean Paul Getty III, grandson of the same Jean Paul Getty, whose early tankers may have carried more than crude, vanishes into the belly of Italy's kidnap economy. The local carabinieri will shake their heads and mutter, "Un altro sequestro," just another rich boy snatched by Calabrian mafiosi. But what unspools over the next 5 months will expose the same cold-blooded arithmetic that once weighed barrels of opium against barrels of oil. To Rome's elite, the boy is less a student and more a living headline. He drinks in Trastevere bars, dabbles in avant-garde filmmaking, dates a German photographer twice his age, and tells Rolling Stone he plans to buy a Maserati by selling his hair for a wig commercial. His grandfather, worth somewhere north of $2 billion, a broken heart. Paul III's rebellious orbit grinds hard against the dynasty's polished facade, a tension already visible when reporters probe the elder Getty's rumored 1920s Asia side hustles and got stonewalled by phalanxes of lawyers. That instinct to protect the brand at any cost, oil back then, reputation now, sets the stage for the darkest negotiation the clan will ever face. The ransom note arrives first at Il Messaggero, Rome's oldest daily, $17 million US, non-negotiable, or the boy dies. It is typed on cheap stationery, signed Prigione Politica. Within hours, AP Wire copies the demand worldwide, pairing it with stock photos of the Getty Villa at Sutton Place and snarky headlines about the stingiest billionaire alive. Italian Interior Minister Paolo Emilio Taviani privately briefs Washington. The U.S. Embassy cables back that neither Interpol nor the FBI has meaningful sway in Calabria's Aspromonte Mountains, ground zero for the 'Ndrangheta's kidnapping racket. Getty Sr., reached by phone at 3 a.m. London time, responds with a line that ricochets through newsrooms. I have 14 grandchildren. If I pay 1 penny now, I'll have 14 kidnapped grandchildren. It sounds brutal, but inside the dynasty it lands as cold logic. Just as his 1920s freight contracts used boring language to hide high-risk cargo, he now cloaks fear in actuarial math. Privately, he tells lawyers he suspects the boy staged the snatch himself, pointing to earlier letters begging for cash to clear drug debts. For 16 weeks, nothing changes except the tabloid hysteria. Mother Gail Harris gives tearful interviews on RAI News, describing her son's lazy smile and childhood love of turtles. California cousins hire astrologers. Italian police tap every Getty phone line from Rome to Surrey, producing 170 hours of scratchy recordings with no breakthrough. A Senate committee back in Washington even floats a bill to criminalize paying foreign ransoms, though it dies in committee when lobbyists warn it could endanger American petroleum personnel abroad. The stalemate snaps on October 21st. A small padded envelope postmarked Palermo reaches a Florentine newspaper. Inside is a severed right ear, a lock of blonde hair, and a Polaroid of Paul bound in a tiny cave, eyes wide with morphine terror. "This is Paul's ear," the note screams in block capitals. "If we don't get money in 10 days, he will arrive in pieces." Italian surgeons confirm the cartilage belongs to a male under 25. The Getty mole on the earlobe clinches it. Flashbulbs erupt outside Villa d'Este, where tourists, still in bell-bottoms, whisper that the richest man alive just gambled his grandson's ear the way he once gambled barrels of morphine base across the Suez. Panic detonates the boardrooms. J. Paul II, the boy's father, living mostly off trust fund crumbs, flies overnight to London, begging his own father for mercy. Getty Sr. relents, but only halfway. He approves a payment of $2.2 million, the maximum the IRS will allow, as a tax-deductible consultancy loss, plus a personal loan of $800,000 to J. Paul II at 4% interest. His tax lawyers at Dewey Ballantine draft a memo classifying ransom under Section 165C3, theft losses, the same loophole once used by railroad tycoon Henry Flagler to write off sabotage during the Florida East Coast strike. The actual handoff reads like pulp fiction. A Getty attorney named Giovanni Iacovoni withdraws the cash in 10, 20, and 50,000 lira bundles, stuffs them into a laundry basket, and drives a beat-up Fiat 500 from Rome to Loria, headlights off, to avoid roadblocks. He leaves the basket in a culvert beside kilometer marker 113 of the Salerno-Reggio Calabria autostrada, then turns around and pretends the Fiat's radiator has overheated to create an alibi when carabinieri ask why he's out after curfew. The kidnappers collect the money at dawn, count it on a plastic tarp, discover it's $9 million short of the original ask, and after phoning their lawyer, yes, even gangsters keep counsel, agree it will do. Paul III is released December 15th, left blindfolded at an abandoned gas station near Castrovillari. He stumbles toward traffic, wearing only corduroys and a filthy sweater. A farmer gives him a lift to a police post, where he eats 3 plates of spaghetti and asks for a beer. By Christmas, he's back in the United States, the stitched ear hidden under shaggy bangs, telling CBS anchor Walter Cronkite the captors treated me like a dog, but not an animal. Behind the reunion photos, the dynasty fractures. Gail sues for divorce. J. Paul II spirals into deeper addiction. Getty III squanders settlement money on London's punk scene, partying with members of the Rolling Stones and nearly overdosing on methadone in 1978. In 1981, he suffers a massive stroke triggered by a cocktail of Valium and alcohol, leaving him semi-paralyzed and nearly blind until his death in 2011. J. Paul Getty's tax evasion schemes. Jean Paul Getty is one of the slickest financial illusionists the IRS never quite pinned down. This is the story the press never really told. How Getty, a self-styled art-loving philanthropist, quietly gamed the U.S. tax system with a global strategy worthy of a Bond villain, stashing over $1 billion in shadowy offshore accounts while crafting a public image as America's generous oil baron. But what was he really hiding behind those museum wings and Shakespearean libraries? It all goes back to Liechtenstein and the Bahamas, 2 places that sound more like luxury vacation destinations than the financial ghost towns where J. Paul Getty built his invisible kingdom. According to reporting by Forbes and supported by international tax records, Getty orchestrated an elaborate trust network, quietly depositing assets in sovereign jurisdictions that refused to play ball with the U.S. Treasury. Liechtenstein especially became his secret vault. This tiny European microstate, known more for castles and alpine postcard views than high finance, was home to a financial trust structure so opaque it could legally disconnect a billionaire's wealth from his name. Getty exploited that, using shell companies and third-party fiduciaries to hold assets in his name without technically owning them, at least on paper. And this wasn't pocket change we're talking about. Sources estimate Getty shielded over $1 billion in taxable income using these offshore trusts, roughly $10 billion today adjusted for inflation. But what really sent eyebrows flying was his 1957 move to England. Officially, Getty claimed that he was relocating for business, oil prospects, board meetings, European expansion, the usual PR boilerplate. But behind the scenes, it was a strategic maneuver to sidestep U.S. taxes. Britain at the time had far more favorable tax codes for non-domiciled residents, especially ultra-wealthy Americans. Getty essentially reclassified himself as a British resident to evade American taxes without actually giving up his citizenship. This move allowed him to shield the majority of his fortune from the IRS while maintaining the illusion of philanthropic nobility in the States. And here's where things get eerily familiar. Getty's move mirrored tactics used by other Gilded Age elites like Andrew Mellon, whose own tax dodging came under federal scrutiny in the 1930s. Mellon, despite being the Secretary of the Treasury, used art donations and trusts to launder his tax bill into cultural sainthood. Getty studied this playbook like a scholar. Even his public image, donating to museums, endowing research institutes, and commissioning classical architecture, was part of the same old money camouflage. It was legacy laundering. If that sounds like fiction, consider this. Getty wasn't just hiding his wealth, he was reinventing it. According to Liechtenstein bank documents leaked during the Panama Papers investigation and confirmed by financial watchdog groups like the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, Getty's trusts were layered and encrypted across jurisdictions. In some cases, assets flowed through as many as 5 holding companies before landing in the final safe account. Each layer blurred accountability. Each layer diluted tax liability. And while modern billionaires like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos play within the complex but legal bounds of American tax law, Getty pioneered a version of avoidance that made the modern shell game look like amateur hour. The brilliance and danger of Getty's scheme wasn't just in how it worked, it was in how invisible it was. The IRS never publicly charged Getty with tax fraud, partly because the legal framework for attacking offshore trusts was undeveloped in the mid-20th century. The U.S. government had only recently begun scrutinizing overseas financial havens, and Liechtenstein's financial secrecy laws were nearly impenetrable. Even when hints of Getty's hidden fortune surfaced in audits or newspaper whispers, they were often buried under philanthropic headlines or shrugged off as clever accounting. But experts have since revisited the scale and implications of Getty's offshore empire. In a comparison drawn by investigative economic historian Nicholas Shaxson, author of Treasure Islands, Getty's tactics bear a striking resemblance to earlier financial scandals, like the Teapot Dome bribery affair under President Harding, where private oil interests bribed government officials to access naval reserves. The connection? Both involved covert manipulation of natural resource wealth to enrich elites behind a veil of secrecy. Teapot Dome was criminal. Getty's scheme? Legal, but only barely, and only because he was steps ahead of regulation. There's even a geopolitical twist. Some analysts have argued that Getty's use of Liechtenstein as a financial hideout gave the microstate undue economic leverage. By the 1960s, Liechtenstein's banks were flush with cash from foreign elites, giving its small ruling class quiet power in shaping international tax cooperation, or, more accurately, delaying it. When the U.S. finally began pressuring offshore jurisdictions in the 1970s, Getty's network was already established, armored, and nearly untraceable. A few watchdog journalists called it the American oligarch's fortress. But Getty wasn't acting in isolation. He was the prototype. His trust structures and residency games would be mimicked for decades to come. The blueprint he drafted helped pave the way for later scandals, from the Swiss UBS tax evasion case in the early 2000s to the more recent revelations in the Pandora Papers. Today, when people ask how billionaires can pay zero in federal income tax while raking in fortunes, the answer often leads back to strategies pioneered by Getty. He may not have been the first, but he was among the most effective. And if you're still wondering whether this story was just smart estate planning or outright evasion, consider this. Getty's own family eventually acknowledged the breadth of his offshore system, albeit subtly. Legal filings tied to the Getty Trust, made public in the early 2000s, show asset structures that bear striking resemblance to his original setup. While these were later restructured in accordance with modern transparency laws, the DNA of Getty's original scheme is still traceable in how modern trusts operate. That legacy has left a long shadow. Even as the Getty Center in Los Angeles dazzles visitors with Van Goghs and ancient sculpture, and the Getty Foundation funds global cultural preservation, the origins of that money remain a story of quiet exile and sophisticated avoidance. It raises tough questions. Can generosity sanitize greed? Can cultural gifts erase financial gamesmanship? Or are these simply two sides of the same gold coin? Maybe the most ironic twist in all of this is that Getty, once the world's richest man, was notoriously stingy in his personal life. Famously, when his grandson was kidnapped in 1973 and held for ransom in Italy, Getty refused to pay. "I have 14 other grandchildren," he reportedly said. He eventually loaned the ransom money to his son, with interest. That's not the behavior of a benevolent patriarch. That's the cold logic of a man who treated even human crises like balance sheet liabilities. Jean Paul Getty Jr.'s drug addiction cover-up. You hear the name Getty, and chances are your mind flashes to art galleries, oil empires, and the glint of old-world prestige. But the truth? It's messier than a canvas smeared with blood. Behind the museum plaques and charitable trusts was a family that didn't just hoard money, they hoarded secrets. And at the center of one of their darkest was Jean Paul Getty Jr., the heir born into billions, who would spend decades drowning beneath their weight. While J. Paul Getty Sr. was off constructing labyrinthine tax shelters across the Bahamas and Liechtenstein, his own son was quietly slipping into heroin addiction, and the family did everything they could to keep it quiet, not out of love, but out of fear of scandal, fear of financial fallout, fear that the perfect Getty image might crack. Now, don't get it twisted. John Jr. wasn't some reckless drifter squandering family wealth on psychedelic trips. He was, by all accounts, the crown prince of the Getty dynasty. Born in 1932 and raised under the watchful eye of one of the most controlling patriarchs in corporate America, he was shipped off to the finest boarding schools in England and shaped into a man meant to one day take the reins of Getty Oil. He spoke the Queen's English, wore Savile Row suits, and had the cool charm of a Hollywood starlet. But wealth, especially the kind soaked in control and silence, has its own gravity. And by the time the 1960s rolled around with its tidal wave of cultural revolution and existential rebellion, John Jr. was already unraveling. Heroin didn't arrive in his life with fireworks. It crept in quietly like so many things in families that deal in secrecy. According to the biography, The House of Getty, by the mid-1960s, John Jr. was fully dependent on the drug. He wasn't just dabbling, he was addicted, deeply, destructively. And while he tried to keep up appearances, his life was quietly falling apart behind the stone walls of discreet London townhouses and tucked-away clinics. Medical records from that time, locked behind the strictest British confidentiality laws, reportedly show repeated admissions to private addiction treatment centers, though nothing ever made it to the tabloids, because it was never meant to. The Getty family wasn't just managing a crisis, they were erasing it. Family staff were paid to keep quiet. Doctors were instructed not to speak. Media inquiries were redirected. Anything that could threaten Getty Oil's pristine image was carefully removed before it could stain. This wasn't a one-off, it was a systematic erasure, designed to keep shareholders happy and keep the patriarch, J. Paul Sr., in control. After all, Getty Oil's valuation at the time was staggering, one of the largest private fortunes ever amassed. A heroin-addicted son didn't fit that portfolio, and the silence only deepened with tragedy. John Jr. had married Talitha Pohl, an aristocratic Dutch beauty and one of the darlings of 1960s counterculture. Their marriage seemed like a dream. Bohemian glamour meets old money privilege. They were photographed in Marrakesh, mingling with Mick Jagger, Yves Saint Laurent, Andy Warhol, the ultimate society icons. But behind the flashbulbs, the same drugs that laced their parties also tore at their sanity. Talitha, too, struggled with substance abuse, and in 1971, she was found dead in Rome from a heroin overdose. She was only 30. The official word was accidental, but whispers of deeper dysfunction haunted the corridors of the Getty homes. Some suspected that the overdose wasn't accidental at all. Some said Talitha had tried to leave. Others whispered about depression, isolation, even abuse. But the Gettys, they stayed quiet. Not a press conference, not a statement, just silence, louder than any headline. And for John Jr., it was the final blow. Talitha's death shattered him. Friends said he became reclusive, erratic, haunted by guilt. He disappeared from public life, retreating into solitude and further into addiction. He moved to a farmhouse in the English countryside, surrounded by books, art, and an ever-dimming light. Meanwhile, J. Paul Sr. tightened the leash. According to biographer Robert Lenzner, Getty Sr. saw his son's addiction not as a tragedy, but as a liability, a risk. He began severing financial ties. John Jr. still held shares in Getty Oil, but the message was unmistakable. You are no longer the future of this family. And what a cruel irony. While the elder Getty was busy dodging taxes with labyrinthine offshore trusts and hiding $1 billion from the IRS, his son was spiraling into darkness, alone. This wasn't just a family scandal, it was a corporate strategy. They handled John Jr.'s addiction the way they handled their money. Bury it, deny it, and if it leaks, spin it. This kind of whitewashed crisis isn't new in America's elite circles. Eleanor Roosevelt's decades-long relationship with journalist Lorena Hickok, kept under wraps to preserve her husband's image. Adelaide Frick, daughter of steel magnate Henry Clay Frick, her lifelong depression was locked away in diaries and family papers, sanitized for posterity. The Gettys played the same game, but theirs had more money behind it, more reach, more ruthlessness. But karma has a twisted sense of humor. And in 1973, just 2 years after Talitha's death, John Jr. would be forced to confront a nightmare more horrifying than any rehab clinic. His son, Jean Paul Getty III, then only 16, was kidnapped by Italian mobsters in Rome. The kidnappers demanded $17 million. The family thought it was a joke. Getty Sr. allegedly believed the boy staged it himself to extort money. But then the kidnappers cut off the boy's ear and mailed it to the Italian newspaper Il Messaggero. Still, the response from Getty Sr. was heartless. "I have 14 other grandchildren," he said when asked if he'd pay the ransom. He eventually agreed to fund the release, but only by giving John Jr. a loan at 4% interest. The world watched in disbelief. The richest man alive, too cheap, too cold, or too proud to save his own grandson without conditions. After the ordeal, John Jr. was never the same. His son survived but suffered lifelong trauma and permanent brain damage from the ordeal and subsequent drug abuse. The Getty legacy, already fractured, was now soaked in tragedy. And still the family pressed on. They built more museums, funded more art, cleaned up the headlines. But the rot had already spread too deep. In time, John Jr. would start to change. The reclusive addict would become something else, a philanthropist, a man seeking atonement. After J. Paul Sr.'s death in 1976, John Jr. became the main benefactor of the Getty Trust. He donated hundreds of millions to causes he believed in: classical art, environmental preservation, AIDS research. In 1997, Queen Elizabeth II made him an honorary Knight Commander of the British Empire for his charitable efforts. It was redemption of a sort, but it didn't undo what had come before. And that's what makes his story so haunting, because it isn't just about drugs or wealth or even family. It's about the cost of silence, the cost of keeping up appearances in a world where vulnerability is weakness and image is everything. Jean Paul Getty Jr. was born into a life of unimaginable privilege, but in the moments that mattered most, when he needed love, support, healing, he was met with cold calculation. Getty Oil's Middle East bribery. Imagine constructing one of the world's most formidable oil empires, not merely through the might of drilling rigs, sprawling pipelines, or meticulously drafted contracts, but through the discreet exchange of briefcases filled with cash in dimly lit, smoke-filled rooms thousands of miles from home. This is not the plot of a cinematic thriller. It is the real-life story of how Jean Paul Getty, one of the 20th century's most iconic oil tycoons, cemented his dominance in the Middle East during the 1950s. In an era when oil deals transcended mere commerce to become intricate dances of diplomacy, espionage, and, at times, outright corruption, Getty's ascent was as audacious as it was calculated. Today, the Getty name adorns prestigious museums and billion-dollar trusts, yet the origins of this empire reveal a far grittier narrative. This account explores how carefully disguised consulting fees enabled American interests, led by Getty Oil, to secure control over some of the world's most lucrative oil fields, and how Getty profited from a high-stakes game played in the shadows, from the bustling streets of Riyadh to the dusty offices of Dammam. In the aftermath of World War II, oil emerged as the lifeblood of global geopolitics. No nation understood this better than the United States, which sought to secure access to the world's most abundant oil reserves to fuel its economic and military ambitions. At the heart of this quest lay the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, home to vast subterranean oceans of crude oil that promised unparalleled wealth and influence. The British, too, recognized the strategic importance of the region, but it was the Americans who would ultimately dominate. And among those leading the charge was Jean Paul Getty, a shrewd and battle-tested businessman whose vision extended far beyond the boardrooms of New York or London. By the 1950s, Getty had already established himself as a formidable figure in global commerce. With a blend of charisma and cunning, he could negotiate with European aristocrats and outmaneuver Wall Street financiers in the same breath. Yet in the Persian Gulf, where cultural nuances and political intricacies governed access to resources, charm alone was insufficient. Influence in this region came at a steep price, one that Getty was not only willing but eager to pay. Historical records, business reports, and reputable sources such as the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg reveal that Getty's rise in the Middle East was not solely the product of strategic timing or technological innovation. It was driven by a more pragmatic approach, enriching the right individuals with utmost discretion. To secure a lasting stake in the Arabian American Oil Company, Aramco, the linchpin of Saudi oil production, Getty employed a tactic as old as commerce itself, payments disguised as consulting fees to key Saudi intermediaries. On paper, these transactions appeared legitimate, recorded as payments for advisory services or regional expertise. In reality, they were bribes, substantial ones. Investigative financial historians and declassified business records estimate that Getty funneled approximately $70 million in such payments over time. To put this figure in perspective, $70 million in the 1950s equates to over $800 million in today's dollars. This was not merely a gesture to smooth negotiations. It was a strategic investment capable of reshaping entire networks of influence. Getty was not purchasing oil. He was securing favor, ensuring silence, and gaining access to concessions that would form the bedrock of his wealth for decades to come. The significance of these payments cannot be overstated, for Aramco was no ordinary oil company. It was the gateway to Saudi Arabia's vast oil reserves, widely regarded as the most profitable patch of land in modern history. Initially established as a joint venture between the U.S. government and American oil giants like Standard Oil of California, Aramco's operations were tightly controlled by Western interests. For Getty to claim a meaningful share of this enterprise, he needed more than legal contracts or corporate alliances. He required allies within the Saudi royal hierarchy, individuals with the power to sway negotiations and unlock opportunities. To achieve this, Getty created those allies through a web of shell companies, ambiguous consulting arrangements, and offshore financial accounts, tools he would later use to minimize U.S. tax liabilities. Getty channeled millions of dollars to influential Saudi intermediaries. These figures, often closely connected to the monarchy, wielded sufficient authority to influence contract terms while remaining distant enough to evade official scrutiny. While the practice of buying influence was not unique to Getty, his execution was unparalleled. Unlike his American competitors, who adhered to slower, more bureaucratic approaches, Getty operated with ruthless efficiency. If a signature was needed, he ensured the means to secure it were readily available. What makes Getty's approach particularly compelling is the sophistication with which these payments were documented. Rather than relying on overt cash exchanges or traceable wire transfers, the transactions were cloaked in euphemistic language. They were recorded as market development fees, regional expertise compensation, or simply business expenses. These terms, innocuous on the surface, masked a singular truth. Money was exchanged for influence. Getty's legal team, ever vigilant, ensured that these arrangements remained beyond the reach of formal corruption charges. Yet the international business community was not deceived. These were not acts of philanthropy but calculated investments, and they yielded extraordinary returns. By the mid-1950s, Getty had secured contracts with Aramco that catapulted his oil empire to new heights. From a relatively modest player in the global energy market, he emerged as one of the most powerful oil magnates of his era, rivaling even the Rockefeller-backed Standard Oil dynasty. Remarkably, Getty achieved this with far fewer initial resources than his competitors, relying instead on his unrelenting determination and willingness to navigate the murky waters of international deal-making. To dismiss this narrative as mere conspiracy would be to ignore the broader historical context. The 1950s marked a golden age for American corporate influence abroad, particularly in developing nations. U.S. companies operated with near impunity, employing tactics that mirrored Getty's playbook. Whether it was United Fruit's dominance in Guatemala, ITT's maneuvers in Chile, or Standard Oil's operations in Iran, the strategy was consistent: secure influence, protect assets, and align with Washington's geopolitical objectives. Getty did not invent this approach, but he executed it with unparalleled precision. In the American press, he cultivated an image as a brilliant entrepreneur and cultural philanthropist, and later as a reclusive genius misunderstood by the very system he had outsmarted. Getty's maneuvering in the Middle East did not occur in isolation. It was deeply intertwined with the United States' strategic imperatives. As the Cold War intensified, control over Saudi oil became a matter of national security. Energy independence was not just an economic goal, but a geopolitical necessity, providing leverage against the Soviet Union's growing influence. Getty's personal success thus served a broader purpose, reinforcing America's foothold in the Persian Gulf at a time when global power dynamics hung in the balance. The consulting fees that fueled Getty's rise were more than private transactions. They were investments in a global strategy that linked oil to power and power to discretion. There is a direct connection between these covert payments and the public treaties that shaped 20th century geopolitics. In this sense, Jean Paul Getty was not merely a businessman. He was an architect of influence, wielding briefcases of cash to build not only an empire, but also a world order defined by American dominance. Anne Rourke, Getty's Hollywood blackmail. By the time Jean Paul Getty had cemented his grip on the oil fields of the Middle East, bribing his way through the Saudi royal court and threading his billions through offshore trusts, his empire was considered impenetrable. From the outside, the Getty dynasty appeared airtight, powerful, clean. But beneath that surface of museum plaques and philanthropic headlines, there were fractures, not just in the marble, but in the bloodline. And one of the earliest, deepest fractures in that carefully curated legacy came from a woman the public barely remembers today. Her name was Anne Rourke Getty, and her story is a reminder that even the wealthiest families can't buy silence forever. To the public, she was the fourth wife of Jean Paul Getty, elegant, reserved, a socialite who eventually became the mother of two Getty heirs, including the ill-fated Jean Paul Getty Jr. But long before she married into one of the richest dynasties in the world, Anne had another life, one the Getty family worked hard to erase. She had been an actress during Hollywood's silent era, and though her time on screen was brief, it came with whispers that refused to disappear. Whispers about how she got her roles, whispers about what she knew, and whispers about how far she was willing to go to climb the golden ladder of the entertainment world. Anne Rourke entered Hollywood at a time when the studio system was an empire unto itself. It was the late 1920s, and the silent film industry was booming. Producers weren't just creative minds, they were kings. They chose who would rise and who would fade. Most young women came to Los Angeles hoping to be noticed, struggling to be seen. But Anne? She wasn't waiting around for luck. She got cast quickly and she got cast well, landing roles in films produced by Paramount Pictures and First National. She wasn't a household name, but she moved fast in a town that crushed most before they even found a script. With that velocity, how quickly she ascended in a system built to devour hopefuls raised eyebrows. Anne didn't have the traditional resume. She had no stage background, no Shakespeare credits, and no notable theater connections, but she had access. Her stepfather, Joseph Rourke, was a close associate of Adolf Zukor, the founding mogul behind Paramount. That connection opened doors, but according to persistent industry rumors preserved in private archives, trade journal footnotes, and scattered mentions in memoirs from the Golden Age, Anne didn't just rely on introductions. She allegedly used information, some say personal, some say scandalous, as leverage. The allegations suggest that Anne Rourke, during her brief but strategic career, blackmailed at least one high-ranking producer and quietly coerced others into casting decisions. These were not official allegations, of course. This was Hollywood, the capital of secrets. But numerous reports surfaced years later, suggesting she knew about hidden affairs, financial cover-ups, and off-the-record misconduct. She wasn't the only one in town who collected secrets, but she might have been one of the few who used them so effectively. One story, passed down in industry gossip and loosely mentioned in studio historian interviews decades later, paints a telling scene. In 1931, Anne reportedly confronted a Paramount casting director at the Trocadero Club in Los Angeles. She had been passed over for a major role. Witnesses claimed she hinted, without stating directly, that she had knowledge about payments made to a teenage extra during a previous production. Just days later, she was suddenly cast in a new film she hadn't auditioned for. The previous actress vanished from the set. The film received no major press. No explanation was ever given. And just like that, Anne had moved again, up the ladder. It's impossible to verify the full truth behind these whispers. Hollywood, even now, is a town built on denial. But what followed was even more curious. By 1932, Anne Rourke's name began to disappear. She stopped receiving roles. Her presence in magazines faded. Gossip columns no longer mentioned her. Studio press releases started to refer to her not as an actress, but as a young socialite. Her acting career hadn't crashed. It had been erased. And it happened just as she began a very different relationship with Jean Paul Getty. They married that same year, in what many described as a quiet, whirlwind courtship. But it wasn't a romance by Hollywood standards. Getty had already been married 3 times. He wasn't known for affection or even emotional availability. He was methodical, transactional, and entirely focused on empire building. He controlled every detail of his life, his business, his children, his money, and, increasingly, his wife. Anne's past as an actress was inconvenient. Her rumored manipulation of the studio system was downright dangerous. Getty didn't want controversy. He wanted control. And according to Getty family biographers, especially those with access to internal family memos and interviews, steps were taken almost immediately to clean up Anne's narrative. Within months of their wedding, studio magazines stopped referencing her screen roles. Publicists instructed reporters to use her married name only. Behind closed doors, Getty's legal team quietly reached out to film distributors and requested that reissues of films featuring Anne Rourke be discontinued. She was recast in the public eye as a quiet, sophisticated wife, a supporting player in the Getty myth. But inside the home, the dynamic was anything but gentle. Getty, by this time, had begun exercising the same kind of domination over his marriage that he used in business. He placed Anne on a strict monthly allowance down to the dollar. He tracked her purchases. He expected receipts. In private, he reportedly demanded she record her expenses in ledgers, which he reviewed. Friends later described her lifestyle not as privileged, but suffocating. It wasn't a marriage, it was management. Still, they had 2 sons together. One of them, Jean Paul Getty Jr., would go on to become a central tragic figure in the Getty legacy, struggling with drug addiction, depression, and an overwhelming sense of alienation from his father. Many have speculated that the emotional dysfunction in the Getty family began long before Jean Paul Jr.'s collapse, and that it may have been rooted in the breakdown of the relationship between his parents. By the mid-1930s, Getty and Anne were living mostly separate lives. The separation was quiet, but absolute. Eventually, the divorce followed, unpublicized, unremarked upon. Anne disappeared from public life entirely. She remarried later, had a quiet life, and rarely gave interviews. She never wrote a memoir, never published an article. And while many former starlets of her generation eventually opened up about their time in Hollywood, about the abuse, the ambition, the manipulations, Anne Rourke never said a word.